The town turned its back on the wounded Vaquero. She turned her kitchen into a hospital. They brought him to the edge of town and left him in the road. Clara Hedrick heard the commotion from the kitchen window. Voices, hooves, the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the ground. And by the time she reached the front gate, the riders were already heading back toward the Grierson ranch at a canter, their horses' hooves raising a cloud of dust that hung in the morning air like a curtain. The man was lying on his side in the dirt, 20 feet from her fence. He was Mexican, dark-skinned, black-haired, wearing the clothes of a working vaquero, leather chaps worn smooth at the knees, a cotton shirt stained dark with blood, and a wide-brimmed hat that had fallen a few feet away and lay crowned down in the dust. His left arm was bent at an angle that made Clara's stomach lurch, and a deep gash above his right eye was bleeding freely, pooling in the dirt beneath his head. She ran to him. She knelt beside him and pressed her fingers to the side of his neck and felt the pulse, rapid but strong. He was unconscious, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. And when she lifted the hem of his shirt, she saw the bruising, deep purple and black across his ribs, the kind of bruising that came from fists and boots, not from a fall. Someone had beaten this man and dumped him at the edge of town like refuse. She looked toward the Grierson ranch. She looked at the man. She made her decision in the time it took to draw a single breath. "Help me," she called to old Thatch, the handyman who lived in the shed behind the livery stable and spent his days whittling and minding other people's business. Thatch was standing in the livery doorway, watching with the wary expression of a man who wanted no part of whatever was happening. "Clara, that's one of Grierson's vaqueros. You don't want to get into that. I don't want a man to die in the road either. Help me get him inside." Thatch looked at her. He looked at the man on the ground. He looked at the dust cloud from the retreating riders. Then he sighed and walked over, and between the two of them, they carried the unconscious vaquero through Clara's gate, up the porch steps, and into the kitchen, where they laid him on the table that Clara had cleared with one sweep of her arm, sending plates and cups crashing to the floor. His name, she would learn later, was Santiago Reyes. He was 31 years old, and he had worked as a vaquero on the Grierson ranch for 3 years. He was, by all accounts, the best horseman in the valley, the kind of rider who could gentle a Mustang in 2 days and rope a steer at a dead gallop and work cattle in country so rough that most men would not ride it at all. He was also quiet, private, and Mexican, and in the town of Limestone Creek, New Mexico Territory, those last 2 qualities had made him a target. What had happened, Clara would piece together over the following days, was this. Santiago had objected to the way Grierson's foreman, a man named Calder, was treating the horses. Calder used a quirt with a lead weight sewn into the tip, an instrument that was designed to cause pain, and that Santiago considered an abomination. When Santiago told Calder to stop, Calder told him to mind his own business. When Santiago took the quirt and broke it over his knee, Calder and 3 other hands held him down and beat him with their fists and boots until he stopped moving. Then they loaded him onto a horse and dumped him in the road outside Clara's house. Why Clara's house specifically was a question that answered itself. Clara Hedrick was the town's problem. She was a widow who lived alone, who spoke her mind at town meetings, who had once confronted the mayor about the condition of the schoolhouse, and who had written a letter to the territorial newspaper about the treatment of Mexican workers on the local ranches that had caused Grierson himself to ride to her house and stand on her porch and tell her, in terms that were polite but unmistakable, to keep her opinions to herself. Dumping a beaten vaquero in front of her gate was a message, mind your own business. Clara did not mind her own business. She set the broken arm. She had learned basic doctoring from her mother, a midwife, and from 3 years of tending her husband through the illness that eventually killed him. She cleaned and stitched the gash above Santiago's eye, using a needle and silk thread that she boiled first in a pot on the stove. She bound his ribs with strips torn from a clean bedsheet, and packed the bruises with poultices of comfrey root that she kept in the pantry for exactly this kind of emergency. He woke on the 2nd day. He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling of her kitchen, and then at her, and his expression, confused, pained, wary, shifted rapidly through several stages before settling on a guarded caution that she recognized as the default expression of a man who had learned not to trust unfamiliar surroundings. "You're in my kitchen," Clara said. "Your arm was broken and your ribs are cracked. You've been unconscious for a day and a half." He looked at her. He did not speak. "I'm Clara Hedrick. Do you understand English?" "Yes." His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "Where?" "The ranch." "You're not at the ranch. You're in town. Calder's men left you in the road. I brought you inside." She paused. No one else was going to. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise. He was not surprised that no one had helped. He was surprised that someone had. The town's reaction was immediate and predictable. By noon on the first day, the news had spread through Limestone Creek like a brush fire, and by the second day, opinions had hardened into positions. The majority view, expressed most forcefully by Grierson's allies, which included the mayor, the mercantile owner, and the pastor of the Baptist church, was that Clara had no business interfering in a dispute between a rancher and his hired man, and that harboring a vaquero who had defied his employer was an act of provocation that would bring trouble to the entire town. The minority view, held by a handful of women and old Thatch, was that a man had been beaten and left in the road, and someone had done the decent thing. Clara did not care about either view. She cared about the man on her kitchen table whose arm was broken and whose ribs were cracked, and who had done nothing wrong except object to the mistreatment of horses. The trouble came on the third day, when Calder himself rode into town. He was a big man with a red face and a voice that carried, the kind of man who occupied more space than his body required, as if his personality needed the overflow. He rode up to Clara's gate and sat on his horse and called her name. She came out onto the porch. Santiago was asleep inside, his arms splinted and his ribs wrapped, his face still swollen and discolored. She closed the door behind her and stood at the top of the steps and looked down at Calder with an expression that she had learned from her mother, calm, steady, absolutely unyielding. "Mrs. Hedrick," Calder said, "that man in your house belongs to the Grierson ranch." "No man belongs to any ranch, Mr. Calder. He's not property. He's employed by Mr. Grierson. He walked off the job. He was beaten unconscious and dumped in the road. That's not walking off the job. That's assault." Calder's face darkened. The red deepened to a color that Clara associated with men who were about to say something they would regret, or more accurately, something that other people would regret. "If he's not off your property by sundown, there'll be consequences." Consequences from whom? From men who don't appreciate a woman sticking her nose where it doesn't belong. Clara looked at him. She looked at his horse, which was shifting nervously under him, picking up the tension in his body. She looked at his hands, which were holding the reins too tight, the hands that had beaten a man for breaking a quirt that should never have existed. "Get off my property, Mr. Calder," she said, "and if you come back, come with a badge, or don't come at all." He stared at her. She met his gaze without blinking. After a long moment, he turned his horse and rode away, and Clara stood on the porch until the dust settled, and the road was empty. And then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and let her hands shake for exactly 30 seconds before she made herself stop. Santiago healed slowly. The arm needed 6 weeks in the splint. The ribs took 4. The cut above his eye closed into a thin, pale scar that would be there for the rest of his life. He was a difficult patient, not because he complained, but because he refused to rest. By the 4th day, he was trying to stand. By the 6th, he was walking, stiffly, and with his good arm braced against the wall, to the porch. By the 10th, he was helping Clara in the garden, pulling weeds one-handed, with a concentration that seemed disproportionate to the task, until she realized that it was not the weeds he was concentrating on, but the act of being useful, the need, deep and urgent, to be something other than a man lying on a table. She learned about him in fragments. He had been born in Chihuahua, the son of a horseman who had taught him to ride before he could walk. He had come north at 22, following the cattle work from Texas to New Mexico, to wherever the horses and the money took him. He was literate in 2 languages, and had a quiet, dry humor that surfaced unexpectedly. Once, when Clara dropped a jar of preserves and cursed, he said, without looking up from his weeding. "In my country, the saints hear that, and add another year to your purgatory." She laughed before she could stop herself, and the sound startled them both. He was good with his hands. Even one-handed, he could repair a hinge, patch a fence, and sharpen a knife with a precision that made Clara's own efforts look clumsy by comparison. When the splint came off and he had the use of both arms again, he repaired the sagging porch, replaced the broken window shutter, and rebuilt the chicken coop door that had been hanging by one hinge since the previous winter. He did these things without being asked, and without expecting thanks. The way a person works who understands that labor is a language, and what he was saying, in the precise, careful grammar of mended fences and leveled shelves, was, "I am grateful, and this is how I show it." Clara watched him and felt something shifting inside her that she did not entirely welcome. She had been alone for 4 years. She had built her solitude into a fortress, thick-walled, self-sufficient, requiring nothing from anyone. Santiago's presence was not battering the walls. It was doing something subtler and more dangerous. It was making them unnecessary. The confrontation with Grierson came 6 weeks after Santiago's arrival. It was not Calder this time, but Grierson himself. A silver-haired man in an expensive coat who rode into town with 3 hands and tied his horse at Clara's gate and waited until she came out. "Mrs. Hedrick," he said, "I've been patient. You've been absent, Mr. Grierson. There's a difference. Santiago Reyes is my employee. I want him returned. He's not your employee. He was beaten by your foreman and abandoned in the road. That ended his employment." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a statement I intend to file with the territorial marshal in Silver City. It describes the assault in detail, the quirt with the lead weight, the 4 men who held him down, the injuries he sustained. It also describes Calder's visit to my house and his threat against me." She held up the paper. "The marshal makes his rounds next month. I can wait." Grierson looked at the paper. He looked at Clara. He looked at the 3 hands behind him, who were looking at their horses' ears with the intense concentration of men who wanted very much to be somewhere else. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," Grierson said. "Your foreman beat a man with fists and boots and left him in the road. I think it's exactly as big as it needs to be." The silence stretched. Grierson was not accustomed to being challenged. Certainly not by a woman, and certainly not in public, on the main street of a town he effectively controlled. Clara could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of options, the measurement of risk against reward. "Calder is no longer in my employ," Grierson said finally, "as of this morning. And the quirt? There are no weighted quirts on my ranch, not anymore. And Santiago?" Grierson's jaw tightened. "Reyes is free to work where he pleases. I bear him no ill will." It was not an apology. It was not justice. But it was enough. Enough to keep Santiago safe, and enough to prove that a woman with a piece of paper, and the willingness to use it, could move a mountain that no amount of silence had budged. Santiago was standing behind the kitchen curtain listening. When Grierson rode away, he came out onto the porch and stood beside Clara and looked at the road where the riders were disappearing in a cloud of dust. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Yes, I did." "Why?" She looked at him. The scar above his eye was white now, a thin line that caught the light. His face was no longer swollen, and she could see it clearly. The strong bones, the dark eyes, the quiet intelligence that he carried like a second language, visible to those who knew how to read it. "Because someone had to," she said, "and because no one should be beaten for defending a horse." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "In my country, there is a word, amparo. It means protection, legal protection, the kind that comes from the law, but also the other kind, the kind that comes from a person who stands between you and the thing that wants to hurt you." "Amparo," she repeated. "You are my amparo, Clara." She felt the word settle into her chest like a stone dropping into warm water, heavy and light at the same time, sinking into a place she had thought was closed. "Stay," she said. "Not a question, not a request. A statement of what she needed, offered without disguise, because she had learned that disguise was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I was never going to leave," he said. The evening light was golden on the porch, and the town of Limestone Creek was quiet, and the road where they had left him in the dust was just a road now, ordinary, empty, leading in both directions. Clara reached out and took Santiago's hand, and his fingers closed around hers, and they stood together on the porch of the woman who had turned her kitchen into a hospital and her voice into a shield. And the frontier was wide and rough and imperfect, but in that moment, on that porch, it was also kind.